There are moments in history when a nation raises its flag, yet its hands remain tied. And for many older Americans watching Africa today, this memory feels strangely familiar. In 1960, 17 African countries celebrated their independence with new flags, new anthems, and new presidents who just years before had been prisoners in their own land. The world cheered. The photos were beautiful. The speeches were emotional. And yet one thing did not change: the money. If your currency is still printed in Paris, if your debt is still denominated in Washington, if every essential import requires approval from banks in London, are you truly free? This is the uncomfortable question that has quietly shaped Africa's economic destiny for 65 years. Political freedom arrived, financial freedom never did. And many Americans over 60 who lived through the Cold War oil shocks, recessions, and the rise of global banking understand better than anyone how the world's financial architecture can determine who rises and who falls. But something extraordinary happened between late 2024 and mid-2025, something most newspapers buried under other headlines. A new financial door opened. For the first time since independence, African nations are no longer trapped in a single global system. A second path has emerged: new payment networks, new currency options, and new leverage in negotiations with the world's economic giants. Suddenly, countries that once had to ask permission can now choose, and that choice changes everything. So let me ask you, because your generation knows history's patterns clearer than anyone. Do you believe that Africa is finally stepping into real financial sovereignty, or are we simply watching a shift from one dependency to another? And if leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso are pushing for true independence, can the world afford to ignore them? If this opening already feels like a missing chapter in today's Africa news, please share this video. Someone else deserves to hear what's really happening. If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine a street market in Dakar in the 1960s, you would see women selling vegetables, fishermen unloading their catch, and children running between wooden stalls. Life was changing. Flags were new, pride was new. The air itself felt different. But the money passing from hand to hand still carried the same weight it had under colonial rule. That weight has shaped Africa's economy ever since. To understand what happened between 2024 and 2025, we must first understand the foundation that held Africa in place for 65 years. It began in 1960, the so-called Year of Africa, when 17 nations gained independence in a blaze of hope and ceremony. But independence of symbols is not independence of systems. The currencies of many former colonies, especially in West and Central Africa, remained tied to the French treasury. 14 countries continued using the CFA franc, a currency printed in Paris and partly controlled by French authorities. Even today, 50% of their foreign reserves must be held in the French treasury, not maybe, but must be. France defends this system as a guarantee of stability: low inflation, predictable exchange rates, access to European markets. And there is truth in that. But truth isn't the whole story, because when a nation needs to import medicine or machinery or simply allocate its own savings, it must often ask for permission. Imagine being told you must request access to the money you earned, the money your farmers, miners, and small business owners worked for. That is not independence. That is management from afar. But even countries without the CFA franc fell into a different kind of trap. After World War II, the global financial system evolved around the United States. Oil, copper, wheat, nearly every major commodity came to be priced in dollars. If Nigeria sells oil in dollars but must buy equipment from China in yuan, they convert USD to yuan and lose money both times. If Kenya wants to buy medicine from India, they still pay in dollars, even though neither party is American. It is like living in a neighborhood where every time you want to buy from your neighbor, you must first change your money into the landlord's currency, pay a fee, then reverse the process. No one designed it to trap Africa, it simply grew that way. But the effect was the same. For ordinary people, this system meant something painfully simple: sending money home became expensive. According to the World Bank, by 2024, remittances to sub-Saharan Africa cost an average of 8.5% per transaction, the highest in the world, because payments had to route through correspondent banks in New York or London. Then came another blow. In August 2025, the U.S. government slipped a new 1% tax into the One Big Beautiful Bill, targeting cash-based money orders, exactly the type millions of African diaspora workers rely on. A domestic worker sending $500 home each month would now lose nearly 10% before her family sees a single dollar. For many viewers over 60 who remember when every cent mattered during recessions and factory layoffs, this struggle feels familiar. The system was not built for the people who need it most. Meanwhile, African currencies weakened under global pressure. Between 2020 and 2024, the Nigerian naira lost 70% of its value, Ghana's cedi fell 60%, Zambia's kwacha dropped 55%. Some of this resulted from poor domestic policy, but much came from international forces. Interest rate hikes in Washington pulled money out of African markets overnight. Kenya's dollar reserves in early 2024 were just $6.8 billion, enough for barely 3.5 months of imports. A bad harvest or oil shock could trigger immediate crisis. Egypt's reserves dwindled from $45 billion in 2011 to under $15 billion by 2023. This was the backdrop the world Africa lived in when the unexpected happened. A second door opened. A financial system outside the old pipelines, outside the old gatekeepers, outside the monopoly that had lasted for 2 generations. For the first time since the era of independence celebrations, African nations could imagine a different path. If you stood in Kazan, Russia on that quiet October morning in 2024, you might not have sensed history unfolding. Delegates were shuffling into conference halls, journalists focused on who would shake hands with whom, and Western media kept their attention on the political theater surrounding the BRICS summit. Yet behind those distractions, a silent shift, one far more consequential, was taking shape. A new doorway opened not with fanfare but with infrastructure lines of code, digital rails, and financial pipes designed to bypass the old routes that had kept African nations tied to New York, London, and Paris. This was the moment when BRICS Pay and China's CIPS system became accessible in a new and unprecedented way. For the first time, 185 countries could route payments without passing through the Western-controlled SWIFT network. No gatekeepers, no colonial-era permissions, no dependency on currencies that had dominated global commerce since World War II. For African nations that had been squeezed by inflation, debt, and dollar scarcity, this wasn't just innovation, it was oxygen. BRICS Pay, spearheaded by Brazil and championed by Russia after being cut from SWIFT, provided the first piece of platform for member countries to trade directly in local currencies. But the true explosion came from CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system built by China. It had existed since 2015, but in 2025 it reached what economists call critical mass. By June 2025, CIPS connected 4,900 banks across 189 countries and processed 12.7 trillion in transactions within just 6 months. That wasn't theory. That wasn't diplomacy. That was real money moving through new pipes. For many African officials, this felt like stumbling onto a second road after decades of being told there was only one. And the reaction was immediate. Kenya moved first. In October 2024, Nairobi announced that $3.5 billion of its Chinese debt would now be restructured and repaid in yuan instead of dollars. For a country whose foreign reserves were under constant pressure, this was monumental. The Central Bank of Kenya later confirmed that by June 2025, yuan holdings made up 5% of the nation's reserves, up from virtually zero just 3 years earlier. Yet Kenya didn't abandon the dollar, it diversified. That was the significance. Ethiopia followed, struggling under IMF declarations that its debt was unsustainable. Addis Ababa entered talks to convert $5.38 billion of its Chinese loans to yuan repayment. The shift provided cheaper interest rates and breathing room for a country battered by civil conflict and food shortages. It wasn't ideological, it was survival. Egypt joined next. In July 2025, Cairo signed agreements with Beijing allowing bilateral trade in local currencies. Egyptian officials also began exploring panda bonds, yuan-denominated bonds that give access to China's deep capital markets. For a nation that had watched its reserves fall from $45 billion to under $15 billion, this wasn't a gamble, it was a necessity. Then came Nigeria. In December 2024, Africa's largest economy renewed a 15 billion yuan currency swap. A fabric trader in Lagos, one whose voice reflected millions, explained how importing textiles from China now took 2 days instead of a week at less than 1% cost instead of 6%. This wasn't geopolitics, this was a woman trying to sustain her business without drowning in fees. South Africa completed the wave. By June 2025, Standard Bank, the continent's largest lender, and Afreximbank became direct CIPS participants. Because Standard Bank operates in 20 African nations, this wasn't merely a South African development, it was a continental one. Across these countries, the reaction was the same: not anger, not rebellion, but relief. For the first time, governments could imagine economic planning without the constant shadow of the dollar shortage, without the endless fear of interest rate hikes in Washington, without asking for permission. And for many elders watching Africa news around the world, this sudden coordination felt like a kind of awakening, a moment reminiscent of independence movements, only this time the battlefield was financial and the victory was leverage. The old system still existed, but now there was another door beside it. And once a people see another door, they rarely forget it. If you walk through any African neighborhood today, from Lagos to Nairobi, you'll see the same scene every month: long lines outside grocery stores, queues at mobile money agents, and workers waiting patiently at corner shops to send a few dollars home. For decades, these quiet routines carried enormous hidden pain. Transaction fees ate into paychecks, currency crashes drained family savings, and every global shock, whether interest rates in Washington or oil prices in the Middle East, seemed to fall hardest on households who had no voice in creating the system they lived under. The ripple effects of Africa's new financial choices are now landing directly in these everyday lives. For the first time, migrant workers are keeping more of what they earn. A domestic worker in New York sending money to Nigeria or Ghana no longer loses nearly 10% of her income. Lower fees through CIPS-based channels mean more money reaches her children, her parents, and her community. For millions of families, this isn't about geopolitics. This is about school fees, medicine, and food. It's the difference between surviving and slipping backwards. Small businesses feel the shift too. Importers who once spent days navigating currency shortages and sky-high conversion fees now complete transactions in hours. A textile trader in Lagos, a spare parts seller in Nairobi, a pharmacy owner in Addis Ababa, they all see the same transformation: fewer middlemen, fewer delays, fewer losses. These are individuals who for decades lived inside the financial equivalent of a storm. Suddenly, the winds feel calmer. But the changes extend far beyond personal finances. Governments themselves are operating with a different kind of confidence. For years, African states lived under the constant threat of dollar scarcity. Budget planning became guesswork. Infrastructure projects stalled. Emergency reserves drained overnight. Every time the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates, African currencies tumbled, inflation soared, and governments scrambled for survival. Now, with alternative payment routes and diversified reserves, officials are breathing, if not easily, at least without the suffocating pressure of the past. Kenya can restructure loans without burning dollars. Ethiopia gains temporary relief from crushing interest. Egypt accesses Chinese capital markets without first securing U.S. currency. Nigeria conducts trade settlements directly in yuan, shielding its economy from some of the volatility that once defined its financial landscape. Still, relief is not victory. Every step forward opens a new vulnerability. If African nations repay loans in yuan, they must earn yuan. That means exporting more to China. If China's economy slows or shifts its priorities, these nations risk being caught in a new trap. Dependency doesn't disappear just because the flag of dependency changes. The same is true domestically. Lower borrowing costs and new payment systems cannot compensate for weak governance. Ethiopia's inflation crisis came not from foreign systems, but from money printed to finance civil conflict. Zambia's debt default happened because leaders borrowed beyond their means. No technology, no matter how modern, can fix decision-making rooted in short-term politics. And then there is the issue of surveillance. Payment data that once flowed through New York and London now flows through Beijing. Who buys what, from whom, in what quantity? Those patterns create power. If SWIFT once placed Africa under Western observation, CIPS now gives China a similar lens. The question isn't whether one side is better. The question is whether Africa gains enough leverage to navigate between them. Still, even with these risks, something undeniable has changed. Ordinary citizens finally feel the system bending even slightly in their favor. A mother receives more of her son's remittance. A business owner pays fewer fees. A government can plan without begging for dollars it does not have. These are small shifts, but after 65 years of financial architecture built above Africa, rather than with Africa, small shifts feel historic. When Americans over 60 look at what's unfolding today, many notice echoes of earlier moments in global finance times when the world's balance quietly tilted long before anyone realized a shift had taken place. And in Washington, the signals emerging from Africa's new economic corridors are being watched with a mix of concern, caution, and calculation. From the U.S. perspective, the biggest immediate issue is not geopolitics, it's dollar stability. The dollar has been the backbone of global trade for nearly 80 years. It gave the United States influence, predictability, and a financial depth no other currency could match. So when countries from Kenya to Egypt begin settling payments in yuan or routing transactions through CIPS instead of SWIFT, Washington does not take it lightly. The concern is not that Africa is leaving the dollar because it isn't, but that Africa is learning to negotiate, and negotiation changes power. The new 1% tax on cash-based remittances enacted in 2025 is part of this picture too. Officially, it was designed to increase oversight and reduce fraud. Unofficially, it pushed millions of African diaspora workers toward alternative channels, accelerating the adoption of non-dollar systems. For many older Americans who remember past financial reforms from the Volcker shock to Dodd-Frank, this feels like a familiar pattern, a small policy shift triggering far larger unintended consequences. Across the Atlantic, Europe, especially France, is confronting a different kind of challenge. The CFA franc, long defended as a tool of stability, is now seen by many Africans as a symbol of dependence. As countries diversify their reserves and utilize BRICS pay or CIPS, France's ability to influence West and Central African economies weakens. Paris argues that change must be gradual, but African nations empowered by new options seem to be signaling that gradualism has limits. Then there is China, the architect of CPES. Beijing does not hide its ambition. It wants the yuan to become a major global currency. What China offers Africa is not liberation, but choice, and choice creates influence. Access to Chinese capital markets, yuan-denominated loans, and a payment system outside Western gatekeeping, all of this strengthens China's strategic position. But Africans understand this. They know every system carries its own form of dependency. The difference now is that dependency is no longer a one-way street. For global investors and multilateral institutions like the IMF and World Bank, Africa's pivot introduces a new layer of complexity. If African nations can borrow, repay, and trade outside dollar-dominated channels, the leverage of Western institutions diminishes. Yet some American analysts quietly admit something refreshing: competition may push all players, including the U.S., to offer fairer terms, more flexible lending, and less intrusive conditions. When there is only one door, it becomes easy to dictate rules. When there are two, everyone behaves differently. And finally, there is Africa's own message to the world. By diversifying payment systems, reserves, and trade routes, the continent is signaling it is no longer content to be a passive participant in someone else's architecture. Leaders from Mali to Kenya, and even voices from Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré, speak increasingly about sovereignty, not as a slogan, but as a practical economic strategy. Older American viewers who lived through the space race or the rise of the Asian tigers sense the same pattern. When a region starts building parallel systems, global order shifts. Whether this shift will lead to stability or new tensions remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: the world can no longer afford to treat Africa as a dependent. It must now treat Africa as a partner, one with choices, leverage, and a growing understanding of its own power. When we step back and look at the bigger picture, it becomes painfully clear that Africa has reached a crossroads unlike any in its modern history. For 65 years, the continent has carried the burden of financial systems it did not design, operating within pipelines that often worked against its own interests. Yet now, quietly, steadily, and unmistakably, those pipelines are being rewired. New doors have opened. New routes have emerged. And after generations of being told there was only one way forward, African nations can finally choose. But choice is not victory. And that is where the real warning lies. Switching from the dollar to the yuan is not liberation. It is merely movement, a shift in direction. True independence, the kind older Americans remember fighting for during their own historic struggles, comes only when a people build systems that reflect their values, their priorities, and their aspirations. Africa cannot afford to simply trade one dependency for another. It cannot rely solely on BRICS pay or CIPS any more than it once relied solely on SWIFT or Western banks, because the moment you rely on a single system, the one who owns that system eventually owns you. That is why many African leaders today, especially voices like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, speak not only of alternatives, but of autonomy. Not ideological autonomy, but practical autonomy, regional payment networks, local currency trade, stronger institutions and policies that protect ordinary people first. His message echoes across the continent. Sovereignty isn't poetry, it is infrastructure, it is agriculture, it is technology, and yes, it is money. And for many viewers following Africa news closely, this shift feels like a long overdue awakening. But awakenings come with responsibility. Africa must use this moment to build, not drift, to coordinate, not fragment, to demand fairness, not gratitude. The world will not hand Africa its financial freedom. But now, for the first time, the world cannot prevent Africa from pursuing it either. So let me leave you with a question, one only you can answer. Do you believe African nations are finally strong enough to design financial systems that defend African interests first? Do you believe leaders like Ibrahim Traoré can guide this transformation, or is the continent still at risk of falling into a new cycle of dependency? Your perspective matters, especially if you are among the first to understand how historic this moment truly is. If this opened your eyes, please share this video. If you want more stories that go deeper than headlines, subscribe. And if you believe Africa deserves the same dignity, choice, and sovereignty as every other region on Earth, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Because after 65 years, maybe this is the moment Africa's money and Africa's future finally come home.